Oil means everything to Russia. It's both one of the country's greatest sources of income, and it's refined to produce the fuel that Russia's forces need for so much of the equipment they use in Ukraine. Without refined oil, Russia lacks everything from diesel that makes its tanks run to gasoline for its people, aviation fuel for its jets, and even lubricants that keep much of its equipment in good condition. And when Russia is being deprived of its oil money, it can't even build the equipment that runs on these refined products. That knowledge will make the last few days especially devastating for Russia. In a double blow to Vladimir Putin's invasion, Ukraine has once again struck deep inside Russia. Only this time, it's done it as China abandons Russia, perhaps once and for all. We'll start with Ukraine's strike. On November 11th, TVP World reported that Ukraine had hit Russia with a flurry of strikes during the previous evening, all of which targeted the country's oil. Among the targets were Russia's Saratov refinery, which seems to have become a particular favorite of Ukraine's drones, as well as the Orsk-Nefteyorsk refinery that is located in the Orenburg Oblast. Adding to yet another series of strikes against Russia's ailing oil refining capacity, Ukraine also took aim at occupied Crimea. It conducted a strike against a sea oil terminal in Feodosia that Russia uses to transport oil out of the country and to its dwindling list of oil customers. That statement gives you a hint about how China has turned its back on Russia, but we'll get to that later in the video. All three of Ukraine's strikes deserve attention, though it's the Saratov one that exposes Russia in more ways than one. In its report on the attack on the Saratov refinery, the Moscow Times said that the attack, which occurred during the early hours of November 11th, represented the fifth time that Ukraine has hit this particular refinery during the fall. Expand the scope to all of 2025, and Saratov has had some of its key infrastructure taken out by Ukraine's drones a total of 7 times. You have to wonder what Russia's air defenses are doing to allow Ukraine to score so many direct hits on such an important refinery. If you listen to Russia's defense ministry, those air defenses are working as they should. On the night of this trio of attacks, the ministry claimed that its air defenses had shot down 37 of Ukraine's drones, with 8 of those being in the Saratov region. But that's what Russia always says, quickly followed by claiming that drone debris is the reason why its refineries end up burning. Russia avoided that excuse this time around. Instead, it chose not to acknowledge any attacks on the Saratov refinery at all. Instead, the region's governor, Roman Buzagin, claimed that Ukraine's drones injured one civilian and shattered the windows in several homes. Ukraine's general staff tells a very different story. Taking to Telegram, the general staff shared a photograph of the outcome of its strike, which appears to show the Russian refinery burning. It also said, a series of explosions were recorded, after which a massive fire was observed in the area of the target. The results of the hits are being clarified. So we don't know exactly how much damage Ukraine did to the Saratov refinery, but we do know that the country's drones hit their target. It's an important target too. Ukraine's general staff goes on to point out that Saratov makes 20 types of refined oil products, including gasoline, diesel, technical sulfur, and vacuum gas oil. Many of these products are being used to serve the needs of the Russian occupiers fighting in Ukraine, meaning any attack on Saratov amounts to the weakening of Russia's ongoing assaults on Ukraine's territory. The Kyiv Independent adds that Saratov refinery processed about 4.8 million metric tons of crude oil in 2023, which gives us a solid idea of the refinery's size and importance to Russia. Ukraine's drones also had to travel a fair way to reach the refinery, as it's located about 370 miles to the east of the Ukraine war front line. However, distance isn't really a problem for Ukraine anymore. Its long-range drones and missiles are striking targets all over Russia. That takes us nicely to Ukraine's strike in the Orenburg region, which may have been even more impactful than the attack on Saratov. The Orsk-Nefteyorsk refinery certainly seems to be larger than the Saratov refinery. That's according to the Kyiv Independent, which says the facility can process up to 6.6 million tons of crude oil annually. It can also turn that oil into more types of products, as the refinery makes more than 30, which include gasoline and diesel, along with aviation fuel, kerosene, and various types of oils. Add the Orsk-Nefteyorsk refinery's capacity to that of the Saratov refinery, and you get up to 11.4 million tons of processing taken offline in a single night, assuming that Ukraine did enough damage to force refinery shutdowns. This strike represents the second time that Ukraine has hit Orenburg's main refinery, which perhaps suggests that the country has established a safe and repeatable aerial corridor to another massive refinery. Ukraine's general staff was also quick to get ahead of any Russian attempt to deny the success of the strike. As with the Saratov attack, it took to Telegram to announce what Ukraine had accomplished in Orenburg. As part of reducing the enemy's offensive potential and complicating the supply of fuel and ammunition to the military units of the occupiers, on November 11th, units of the Defense Forces of Ukraine hit the facilities of the Orsknefteyorg-Zintez oil refinery in the Orenburg region of the Russian Federation, the announcement read. We also have confirmation of what Ukraine managed to destroy in the strike. As the General Staff goes on to say, explosions and a fire were recorded on the territory of the facility. According to preliminary information, one of the primary oil processing units, APU, was hit. The results of that hit are being clarified. Processing units, as the name implies, are key to turning crude oil into usable products. The General Staff claims it hit one of these units in Orenburg, and again, like with the Saratov strike, it shared a picture to Telegram showcasing a massive plume of smoke rising into the sky above the refinery. So Ukraine delivered a swift 1-2 knockout to some of Russia's refining capacity. With oil production tackled for the night, Ukraine switched its focus to the facilities that Russia used to get its oil out of the country. We don't have as much information about Russia's Feodosia port as we do about the 2 refineries Ukraine hit in the early hours of November 11th. However, Ukraine's General Staff covered the important information in the same Telegram post in which it announced the Saratov strike. Also hit was JSC Marine Oil Terminal, a key hub for the supply of fuel and lubricants by sea to the Crimean Peninsula and the temporarily occupied territories of southern Ukraine. As with the Saratov strike, the full results of Ukraine's aerial assault are being assessed. However, it's believed that Ukraine managed to destroy or at least damage several tanks located on the site of the Feodosia port. The odds are that those tanks were filled with refined oil products, most likely fuel, that were going to make their way into occupied Ukraine by way of the Caspian Sea. All in all, it was a bad night for Russian oil, but really, it's been a bad few months. Ukraine has ramped up its strikes on Russia's oil over the last few months because it knows that the liquid gold that Russia produces helps to power Putin's war machine. The 3 strikes we just discussed are the latest in a series of dozens that have crippled Russia's refining capacity and are now looking to take out stored oil as well as the facilities that make Russia's fuel. To say that the impact of these strikes has been significant would be an understatement. Economically and militarily, Russia has been dealing with a kind of oil shock all of Ukraine's making during the last few months. On November 11th, Elliot Clark, writing for the Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute, covered the extent of this impact. Clark says that Ukraine has targeted 55% of Russia's oil refineries, which has led to a severe decline in the income Russia generates from its fuel and other refined products. Why? Well, Russia is making fewer of these products because so many of its refineries are offline. What the country is still able to make is being used to serve the military or its domestic population, which leaves very little left over to sell to other nations. In fact, Russia extended a total ban on gasoline exports, along with issuing a partial ban on diesel exports on September 30th, the Moscow Times reports. Neither will be sold as they once were until 2026, and that assumes that Russia is able to get its refining capacity back to where it needs to be. Clark provides short, medium and long-term forecasts for Russia in the wake of Ukraine's relentless strikes. In the short term, Clark says, Ukraine is very likely to continue its strikes and Russia's citizens will have to deal with rising fuel prices. That's not ideal, given that Russia's fuel prices had risen by 11.6% already between January and October. More price increases now, especially due to supply being so low as a result of Ukraine's refinery strikes, are only going to cause more frustration domestically. Over the medium term, Clark adds, governments and businesses will inevitably seek new suppliers, given that Russia is no longer a reliable supplier of fuel. Selling cheap oil doesn't mean much for Russia when it doesn't have anything to sell. That's how other countries will start to see things too, and we get another hint at the blow that China delivered to Russia in November here. The same issues will persist over the long term, Clark concludes. That is, assuming Ukraine maintains the level of consistency of the refinery and oil storage strikes that we've seen since August. There's no reason why it wouldn't. Ukraine is building long-range drones by the thousands, and Russia doesn't seem to have the air defenses it needs to stop them. Chatham House adds that more attacks on Russia's oil refining offer Ukraine its best possible defense against Russia's focus on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. On November 10th, the outlet said that it's all about replying to Russia's pressure with pressure of Ukraine's own. That pressure is being felt domestically inside Russia, as Chatham House reports. In Crimea and a small number of other regions, there have been reports of petrol shortages. The government is under pressure to keep prices stable, to limit public dissatisfaction and broader questioning of the purpose of the war, the outlet claims. This involves Moscow paying subsidies to oil companies to compensate them for diverting production intended for export to the domestic market. The overall point is that Ukraine's strikes on Russian oil are costing Putin. That's all the more reason for them to continue. Russia's president would already have been smarting after hearing the news of this trio of Ukrainian strikes. The one saving grace, he might think, is that Ukraine is primarily targeting Russia's refined oil. Crude oil, though certainly not safe, is still available in huge quantities in Russia. That means the country can still sell plenty of crude to countries capable of refining that oil into products of their own. It's a strategy that has worked throughout the war. As Interfax reports, Russia managed to generate about $189 billion from the export of oil products in 2024, as it sold 7.6 million barrels per day, despite Western sanctions. More of the same should still keep the money flowing into Russia. However, 3.5 million barrels of the 7.6 million barrels per day were going to India and China, Interfax notes. And it's here, where China comes into play, to deliver the second major blow to Russian oil that Putin has been forced to absorb in the space of 24 hours. On November 11th, Newsweek reported that a Chinese oil refiner named Yanchang Petroleum, which is backed by one of China's provincial governments, has decided that it's going to cease all purchases of Russian oil. That announcement hasn't been made officially, but several anonymous traders who are familiar with the refinery say that pulling the plug on Russian oil is basically a done deal for the firm. United 24 Media follows up on this report by noting that Yanchang Petroleum processes about 348,000 barrels of oil per day, giving the company an annual refining capacity of about 127 million barrels. Of those barrels, 26 million make up the company's yearly import quota. For Russia, that may mean that 26 million barrels worth of crude oil sales have just vanished into thin air. That's the last thing that Putin wanted to hear, as two of his refineries and one of his ports burn as a result of Ukraine's long-range strikes. Worse yet, this news follows on from reports that several of China's state oil giants had suspended purchases from two of Russia's major oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. We covered those suspensions and what they could mean in a separate video, so check that out if you want to learn more. Of course, the obvious question has to be asked: why is China suddenly turning its back on Russian oil? If you've already watched the video we just mentioned, you know that the answer can be summed up in two words: Donald Trump. After spending months dealing with Putin constantly lying about wanting to achieve a ceasefire or peace deal in Ukraine, only for the Russian president to intensify his attacks on Ukraine, Trump has started to follow through on the threats that he made. One of those threats was to impose harsher sanctions on Russian oil, and the US did just that on October 22nd. That's when the BBC reported that the US has implemented what Trump called tremendous new sanctions against the previously mentioned Russian oil giants Rosneft and Lukoil. The sanctions were big news. They represented the first direct intervention the Trump administration has made in 2025, suggesting that Putin's refusal to compromise on a peace deal has pushed the US president over the edge. By sanctioning these two companies, Trump also sent a clear message to Russia's oil buyers, including China. Keep buying from Russia and there will be financial hell to pay. China has heeded that warning, which is why we're now seeing so many of its companies pull away from Russian crude. As the BBC reported at the time, Trump is urging these countries, meaning China and India, to halt purchases of Russian oil altogether, forcing them to find alternative suppliers, possibly at a higher cost. But refusal to do so could see China and India attracting secondary sanctions from the US. China doesn't want to deal with secondary sanctions. And it seems that even the massive discounts Russia is offering on its crude oil aren't enough to tempt it to continue buying now that Trump is getting serious with his oil-related threats. Coming back to Yanchang Petroleum's decision, we have more evidence that the company is moving away from Russian crude due to a tender for deliveries that the company has released. That tender covers the period from December to mid-February, and the fact that it exists at all tells us that the company is looking for a new supplier. Russia used to sell plenty of oil to Yanchang. Newsweek suggests that the company usually accepted a shipment of Russian crude per month, so its decision to halt those shipments is likely to cost Russia millions, if not billions of dollars. It's decisions like these that will chip away at Putin's already diminishing war fund. As the BBC notes, Russia's crude oil accounts for almost 20% of China's energy imports. That was good news for Russia in one sense, as Putin likely believed that China had become so heavily dependent on Russian oil that it would struggle to move away. However, it also means that another 80% of the country's energy imports come from nations other than Russia, which tells us that China has more options than Putin might anticipate. What makes Yanchang's decision even more interesting is that it comes at a time when Russia is getting even more desperate to attract buyers for its crude oil. On November 6th, Reuters reported that Russia's Ural crude oil is trading at its steepest discounts versus Brent crude oil in about a year. The price gap between the two classifications of crude has increased to about $4 per barrel, from a previous $2 gap. Think about what this means in the context of 26 million barrels of crude that Yanchang imports per year. Assuming all of those barrels come from Russia, That $4 difference between Urals and Brent crude would amount to a yearly saving of $104 million. That isn't pocket change. It's a massive sum of money that Yanchang is willing to lose out on saving, and it all seems to be due to Donald Trump's sanctions. Putin will be hoping that China will come back on side. That's a distinct possibility, as there is a whiff of China waiting to see what happens with its relationship with the United States before it makes permanent decisions about whether its companies restart their Russian oil purchases. If that relationship goes south, Chinese companies may start buying Russian oil again. However, Trump seems to have sensed this, and he had already dangled a pretty major carrot on the end of a stick that he hoped would move China further away from Russia around 2 weeks before Yanchang made its decision. That carrot was tariffs, or more accurately, the reduction of them. On October 30th, NBC News reported that Trump had met with China's President Xi Jinping. The meeting was a 12 out of 10, according to Trump, and it led to Trump announcing that the US would immediately reduce its fentanyl tariff on China from 20% to 10%. Though other tariffs still remain in force, as NBC points out, it's pretty clear what Trump is doing here. Using the promise of reduced or eliminated tariffs, the US is pushing China into making a decision. Does it value cheap Russian oil or an easier trade relationship with the US? If Chinese companies halting Russian crude oil purchases is anything to go by, it seems that China would rather take steps to eliminate tariffs. That could be the death knell for Putin and his Ukraine invasion. If the US continues to reduce tariffs, essentially rewarding China for what Trump sees as good behavior in the process, Russia will lose out on billions of dollars per year. The crude oil that it's struggling to refine due to Ukraine's strikes won't even be sellable, and the pressure on Putin will mount. Russia's leader was hit with a double blow on November 11th. The combination may be a sign of far more crippling blows to come if current patterns are sustained. As Putin attempts to deal with what must feel like a betrayal by his Chinese allies, he also has betrayals from within contend. Russian citizens are trying to cripple Putin's war machine, and you can find out how if you watch our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of Russia's deteriorating oil situation. And thank you for watching.